Chapter 1. Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Mr. Sherlock Holmes was seated at the breakfast table as I stood behind him on the rug and picked up the walking stick which our visitor had left behind the night before. It was a very fine piece of wood with an inscription on a silver band near the top which read, "To James Mortimer, M.R.C.S., from his friends of the C.C.H., 1884. "Well, Watson, what do you make of it?" "How did you know what I was doing? I sometimes think you have eyes in the back of your head." "I don't, but I do have a very well-polished silver coffee pot in front of me. What do you think about our visitor's stick? It's a shame we weren't home last night, because now we don't know the purpose of his visit. Can you tell anything by looking at his stick?" "I think," I said, trying to follow my friend's methods, "that Dr. Mortimer is a successful elderly doctor who lives in the country and does most of his visiting on foot. I say that because the stick is very well used, so he has done a lot of walking with it. The C.C.H. is probably some kind of hunt club where he lives and whose members he has helped." "Excellent, Watson. Well done." I was very pleased that he had complimented me, and I gave him the stick. He looked at it carefully for a moment, and then got his magnifying glass and looked at it again. "It's very interesting, and we should be able to make several deductions. I'm afraid, however, that most of your conclusions were wrong after all." Seeing my disappointment, he added, "You were right to deduce that the man is a country doctor who walks a great deal." "Is that all?" "Well, you see, dear Watson, a presentation to a doctor is more likely to come from a hospital than a hunt, and if you put the letters C.C. in front of hospital, you automatically think of Charing Cross. All right. So, he worked in the city before he went to the country. "I think we can do better than that," said Holmes. "We can be quite certain the stick was given to him when he left the hospital. But he was probably not a member of the staff, since members of staff at Charing Cross Hospital would be very unlikely to leave and go to the country. He must have been a student or a house surgeon. And as the stick was given to him only 5 years ago, he must still be under 30 years old and not be the elderly doctor you suggest." I opened my mouth to speak, but Holmes went on. "He is friendly, unambitious, absent-minded, and the owner of a dog." "We can check some of that," I said. Going to the bookcase, I got down the medical directory and looked up Dr. Mortimer. There were several, but only one that could be our visitor, and I read it out to Holmes. It says, "Mortimer James, M.R.C.S., 1882, Grimpen, Dartmoor, Devon. House surgeon, 1882 to 84, at Charing Cross Hospital. He must be a clever man because he has won several prizes, and he published a few journal articles, and he is now the medical officer for Grimpen, Thornsley, and Highborough." "There is no mention of the Hunt Club, Watson," said Holmes, with a wicked smile. "But you were right to deduce that he was a country doctor." "There's no mention of him being friendly, unambitious, and absent-minded either," I remarked. "But we do not need the book to tell us that," replied Holmes, "because we have his stick. Only friendly men receive gifts such as that when they leave a place. Only unambitious men would leave the city to go to the country for a career, and only an absent-minded man would leave his walking stick behind without leaving a visiting card." "And the dog?" "The dog sometimes carries the stick for its master, and you can see its teeth marks in the middle of it. The space between the marks is too wide for a terrier and not wide enough for a mastiff. I'm sure it is a curly-haired spaniel." He had been walking around the room as he spoke and now stopped by the window. "How can you be so sure about the type of dog?" "I can see it through the window, for its owner has just arrived on our doorstep." The doorbell rang, and it was not long before Dr. James Mortimer was shown into the room. He was a very tall, thin man, with a long nose that shot out from between his two gray eyes, which sparkled behind his gold-framed glasses. As soon as he saw his walking stick, he picked it up. "I would not like to lose that stick," he said, "as it was a gift on the occasion of my wedding." "That's terrible," said Holmes. Dr. Mortimer looked at him in surprise and asked why it was terrible. "You've made a mess of our little deductions," smiled Holmes. "Nothing more." "I married, which meant that I had to leave the hospital, so I found a home of my own in the country." "Well, perhaps we were not so far wrong after all," said Holmes. "I see by your fingers that you make your own cigarettes. Please be seated and make yourself comfortable." The young doctor did so, taking out some tobacco and paper, and making a cigarette with his unusually long and narrow fingers, and Holmes sat patiently waiting and observing our strange visitor. "Mr. Holmes," he said suddenly, "I have come to see you because I have a very serious and unusual problem. I am not a practical person, so I thought it best to consult you, for you are the second highest crime expert in Europe." "And who is the first?" exclaimed Holmes, almost angrily. "For a precisely scientific mind, Monsieur Bertillon is unsurpassed. Then perhaps you should go and see him. But I need a person who combines science with a practical mind, and in that regard, everybody knows that you stand alone." "I think, Dr. Mortimer," said Holmes, still not entirely satisfied, "that you had better tell us about the problem you would like us to examine." Chapter 2. The Curse of the Baskervilles. Dr. Mortimer began the statement of his problem by telling us that he had an old document in his pocket. "I know," interrupted Holmes, "and I think its date is approximately 1730. I can see a couple of inches of it sticking out of your pocket, and I would not be a very good expert if I couldn't date it from the writing I see on it, especially the way the letter S is written." When Dr. Mortimer had overcome his surprise, he explained that the exact date was 1742, and that it was a statement of a legend that ran in the Baskerville family. "It is an old story," he said, "but I must make a decision within 24 hours, and the problem I face cannot be understood unless you also know this story. Please allow me to read it to you." There are several versions of the story of the Hound of the Baskervilles, but since I am descended from Hugo Baskerville, I have written the story as it has been passed down. My sons do not allow the evil of the past to rule your days, but be careful, so that the terrible things our family has suffered will not return. In the middle of the 17th century, the Lord of Baskerville Hall was a wild and evil man called Hugo, who fell in love with a farmer's daughter who lived nearby. She was a good and gentle young lady and did everything she could to avoid him. One night, however, when Hugo knew that the farmer and his sons were not home, he went to the house with some of his friends and carried her off to the hall, where they locked her in an upstairs room while they ate and drank noisily downstairs. The poor girl was very frightened, but she managed to climb out of the window and began to run home. Hugo, however, soon noticed that she was gone, and he ran downstairs in great anger. He stood on the table and swore that he would give his soul to the devil if only he could catch the girl before she got home. He chased the girl on his black horse, with his hunting dog showing the way. His friends soon followed on their horses, still drinking and shouting. There was a bright moon that night, and they could easily see where they were going, although Hugo was by now a long way in front of them. Then they saw a shepherd, who told them that he had seen the girl being chased by the hounds and Hugo, and behind him a hound that was the most frightening animal he had ever seen. Soon they saw Hugo's riderless black mare, obviously frightened. It was galloping back toward the hall as fast as it could. A little further along, they saw Hugo's hounds, frightened and hiding behind some bushes at the top of a narrow valley. 3 of the men rode slowly into the valley, where large stones had been placed by the ancient people. They saw the body of the young girl, who had died of fear and exhaustion, and of Hugo Baskerville, who lay dead beside her. Standing over Hugo was a huge black hound, larger than any of them had ever seen before, and as they watched, it tore out Hugo's throat. It turned to look at them, blood dripping from its mouth and its eyes blazing like fire. the three men galloped out of that valley as quickly as they could. One of them died of fear that very night, while the other two were mad for the rest of their lives. This hound, my sons, has cursed the family since that night, for many of the Baskervilles have had violent or mysterious deaths, from Hugo Baskerville to his sons, Roger and John. Sherlock Holmes looked at Dr. Mortimer and said, "It is an interesting story if you are a collector of fairy tales. Then let me read you something a little more recent, Mr. Holmes," replied the doctor. "It is the Devon County Chronicle for June 14th this year." He took a folded piece of newspaper out of his pocket and began to read. "The recent sudden death of Sir Charles Baskerville will sadden everybody in the county, as he was a well-liked and respected man and had made many friends in Dartmoor during the 2 years he was at Baskerville Hall. He had made a lot of money in South Africa and, being childless, was using his wealth generously to benefit the community. The inquest into his death only heard from the 2 servants at the Hall, Mr. and Mrs. Barrymore, who acted as butler and housekeeper. They said that Sir Charles suffered from depression, and Dr. Mortimer agreed. Sir Charles told the butler that he was planning to return to London the next day. Then he went for his usual evening walk. He did not return, and at midnight Barrymore went to look for him. He followed Sir Charles's footprints along the muddy path until he came to a gate, where Sir Charles had obviously stopped for a time. He continued down the path until he found his master's body lying near the end of it. A man called Murphy was on the moor at the time, and says that he heard shouting, but he was drunk at the time and was not to be trusted. There were no signs of violence on the body, although the face had an expression of fear. The post-mortem reported that Sir Charles had a weak heart and died of a heart attack. The inquest made it clear that stories of a huge hound that some villagers had heard should not be believed. The heir of Baskerville Hall is Mr. Henry Baskerville, the son of Sir Charles's younger brother. It is believed that Mr. Henry Baskerville is in America at present. "That's more interesting," commented Holmes, when Mortimer had finished. "I had read about the death, but I was busy on another case at the time. Do you know anything more than what is in the newspapers?" "Yes, indeed. I have not told anyone because I am a man of science, and did not want to endorse a superstition or scare away the new owner of Baskerville Hall. The only educated men for many miles in the moors are Mr. Franklin, of Laughter Hall, and Mr. Stapleton, the naturalist. Sir Charles would never go out onto the moor at night for fear of being attacked. He asked me several times whether I had heard the hound howling at night, but I never had. I was there within an hour when he died. Everything said at the inquest was correct. I went over to see his body. He lay face down on the ground with his arms out and his fingers dug into the ground. At the inquest, Baskerville said that he saw nothing else, but I did. I saw footprints, Mr. Holmes." "Footprints?" said Holmes, leaning forward. "A man's or a woman's?" Mortimer looked at us for a moment before replying. "Mr. Holmes, they were the footprints of a gigantic hound." Chapter 3. The Problem. When Dr. Mortimer said that the footprints he had seen near the body of his friend Sir Charles were those of a giant hound, I must admit that he frightened me a little. Holmes, however, was clearly interested and asked many questions to establish some more facts of the case. Dr. Mortimer told him that the footprints were too large for a sheepdog, and they were no closer than 20 yards to the body. Sir Charles was 50 yards from a summer house at the end of the path where the body was found. The locked gate where Sir Charles had rested was about 4 feet high, so a person could have easily climbed over it. However, the only footprints he had seen were those of Sir Charles. "Are you sure that there were no other footprints?" "Yes. His were the only ones, and he had stood at the gate for some time because he had dropped ash from his cigar twice. Not only that, but the footprints changed shape when he left the gate, as if he were walking on his toes. This really is a very interesting case, and I wish you had called me in earlier, Dr. Mortimer. By now, anything I could have discovered on the path will have disappeared. I was reluctant to call you in because it may have attracted unwanted publicity, and I was also doubtful about what anyone could do about what might be a supernatural curse. Do you believe that the Hound is supernatural? I didn't say that it was, but there have been some strange stories about people seeing and hearing a large animal on the moor at night. I questioned some of them, ordinary hard-working farming people, and they told me that it had fire coming from its eyes and mouth. As a result, almost nobody will go out onto the moor at night. I'm not sure what to believe. I have never investigated things beyond this world, replied Sherlock Holmes, and it would certainly be a challenge to do so. But the Hound's footprint is real. If you really think it may be supernatural, why have you come to me at all? You say it is useless to investigate the death of Sir Charles, and yet you ask me to do it. I am not asking you to investigate his death, but I do want you to give me some advice. Sir Henry Baskerville, the heir, is arriving at Waterloo Station in an hour and a quarter. Our inquiries discovered him farming in Canada. He seems an excellent man, and the people of the county will be pleased to have him there. Are there any other family members? Sir Henry is the son of the second brother, who died young, but Sir Charles had a third brother, Roger, who was the black sheep of the family. He was like the Hugo in the story and made so much trouble that he eventually had to flee to South America, where he died. Sir Henry is the last of the Baskervilles. What do you think I should do with him? Is it safe for him to go to Baskerville Hall, where he is eagerly awaited, but where all the members of his family seem to meet tragedy? Holmes thought for a moment. Then he asked a question. Do you think it is a supernatural power that makes it dangerous for Sir Henry to go to Baskerville Hall? There is some evidence to suggest that it may be. Yes, but if you are right, it will be just as dangerous for him in London as it is in Dartmoor. A supernatural power restricted to a local area seems a contradiction in terms. You would not joke about it if you actually came into contact with it, responded Dr. Mortimer. I suppose your advice is to take him straight to Dartmoor and Baskerville Hall. No. Go and meet him at the station and keep him in London without telling him about the Hound. Return here tomorrow at 10 with him, and I will give you my advice. Very well, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Mortimer picked up his hat to leave. One more question, Dr. Mortimer. You said some people saw this Hound on the moor before Sir Charles's death. That's right. 3 people saw it. I spoke to each of them myself. Has anyone seen it after Sir Charles's death? I have not heard of any. Thank you, Dr. Mortimer. Good morning. When Dr. Mortimer had gone, I left too. I knew Holmes needed peace and quiet to think. He sat in the room smoking so many pipes that I had to open some windows when I returned that evening. I see you've been at your club all day, he said. Yes, but how did you know? Well, it is rather obvious. It's not a pleasant day, and your clothes are still neat and tidy. Where else could you have been? That's true, I was forced to admit. I have been in Devonshire, he announced, though I have remained in this room. On the table, there was a large-scale map of Dartmoor, and I understood what he meant. He had studied the map closely. Here is Baskerville Hall, and here is the nearby village of Grimpen, where Dr. Mortimer has his rooms. Here is Laughter Hall, and this house must belong to Stapleton, the naturalist. There's nothing else there. It's a wild, lonely place, but already I know it well. What do you think of the case? I asked. We have 2 questions to answer. First, was a crime committed? Second, if it was, what crime was it, and how was it done? If the problem is supernatural, we cannot solve it. However, we must first explore every other possibility. I have been thinking about it, I said, and I can't see why Sir Charles began to walk on his toes after leaving the gate. He didn't walk on his toes, replied Holmes. He ran. From what? That is the question. But he must have been frightened even before he began to run. How can you say that? If he was frightened of something that came to him across the moor, why did he run away from the house? He should have run to the house, where he would have found help. My other question is why he was waiting for someone outside rather than inside the house, and on the night before he was to leave for London. I think it is beginning to make sense, Watson. Chapter 4. Sir Henry Baskerville. Dr. Mortimer arrived punctually at 10 o'clock the next morning, accompanied by Sir Henry Baskerville. Sir Henry was a small, dark-haired young man of about 30 years old, sturdily built and with a strong, weather-beaten face. "This is Sir Henry Baskerville," said Dr. Mortimer. "Why, yes," said Sir Henry. "Do you know that if my friend had not suggested coming to see you this morning, I would have come on my own? I understand that you like little puzzles, and I've had one this morning that requires more thinking than I am able to give it. Take a look at this letter, which I received this morning. The address, Sir Henry Baskerville, Northumberland Hotel, was written in rough letters, and the postmark showed that it had been sent from Charing Cross the previous evening." "Who knew that you were going to the Northumberland Hotel?" asked Holmes. "Nobody could have known. We only decided after I met Dr. Mortimer, and he had been staying with a friend until then. I didn't tell my friend where I was going," added Dr. Mortimer. "Somebody is taking a very keen interest in your movements," remarked Holmes. Sir Henry pulled out a message from an envelope. The letters were cut out of a newspaper. It said, "If you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." Only the word "moor" was written in ink. "Who is taking such an interest in my business?" asked the heir of Baskerville Hall. "What do you make of it, Dr. Mortimer?" asked Holmes. There was nothing supernatural about the letter. "No," replied the doctor, "but it might have been sent by someone who believes the business is supernatural." "What business?" asked Sir Henry sharply. "It seems that everybody knows more about my business than I do." "You will know all about it before you leave this room," promised Holmes. "But I would like to study this document first. Do you have yesterday's Times, Watson?" I brought him the newspaper. He immediately turned to the inside page and glanced down the columns. "What a good article about free trade," he said. "Don't you think this is a particularly good sentence?" And he read out a long sentence to us. Sir Henry expressed the question we all had in our minds when he said, "Haven't we gone off the subject a bit?" "Not at all," said Holmes. "That sentence contains all the words of your letter except the word more." "That's amazing," cried Sir Henry. "How did you know so quickly that it came from that newspaper?" asked the equally amazed Dr. Mortimer. "A knowledge of the different types of print used by our numerous newspapers is one of the most important tools a detective has," replied Sherlock Holmes. "So, someone cut the words out of yesterday's Times," said Sir Henry, "with a pair of scissors?" "Nail scissors," said Holmes. "Look, you can see that the scissors had very short blades by the number of cuts around the longer words." "What else does the letter tell us?" asked Sir Henry. "The sender was a highly educated man because the Times is only read by highly educated people, although he disguised his own handwriting and made it look uneducated. The words are not neatly pasted, so I believe that it was done in a hurry. The letter was probably written in a hotel because the pen and ink have given the writer some trouble. If we were able to examine the waste paper baskets of all the hotels around Charing Cross, I'm sure that we would find a copy of the Times with the inside page cut up. What's this?" He was looking carefully at the letter, holding it just a few inches from his eyes. "Well?" "It's nothing. It's just a blank piece of paper without even a watermark on it. I think we have got all the information we can from this letter. Has anything else of interest happened to you since you arrived in London, Sir Henry?" "I don't think so," replied Sir Henry. "Have you noticed anyone following you around?" "No." "Why should anyone follow me around?" "We'll come to that. Have you lost anything?" "Well, one of my boots is missing." "It's only mislaid," interrupted Dr. Mortimer. "We will find it when we return to the hotel." It is not worth bothering Mr. Holmes with such unimportant events." "I would like to know about it," said Holmes. "I put them outside my door last night, and this morning there was only one. The staff could not tell me where it was. The worst thing is that they were brand new. I bought them yesterday and had never worn them." "Did you do any other shopping?" "Yes. Dr. Mortimer helped me choose suitable clothes to wear as the new master of Baskerville Hall." "One boot seems a useless thing to steal," said Holmes. "Dr. Mortimer is probably right, and it will not be long before the missing boot is found. I think, gentlemen, that it is time for you to tell me what is going on," said Sir Henry. Holmes agreed, and Dr. Mortimer repeated the performance of the previous day, reading the old document and the newspaper article and telling Sir Henry what he knew. "Well, I have heard of the Hound," said Sir Henry, "but I have never taken it seriously." "The question that we need to answer is whether or not you should go to Baskerville Hall," said Dr. Mortimer. "There appears to be some danger." "Do you mean danger from supernatural forces, or danger from people?" "That is what we have to find out," said Holmes. "Nothing will stop me from going to the home of my people," said Sir Henry, "and that is my final answer. In the meantime, I am going back to my hotel, now for a rest. Will you come to the hotel and have lunch with us at, say, 2 o'clock? Then we can talk further about this matter." It was agreed, and our visitors set out to walk back to their hotel. As soon as they had left, Holmes told me to get my coat and hat, and we rushed out after them. They were about 200 yards along the street, and we followed them slowly. They stopped to look into a shop window, and Holmes gave a little cry of satisfaction. He was looking at a cab on the other side of the street. It had also stopped, and when Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer walked on, the cab moved slowly along with them. "There's our man, Watson. Let's have a look at him." I saw a face with a black beard look at us from the cab, which suddenly sped away. Holmes was very angry with himself for not finding out more about him. "I suspected that Sir Henry might be followed," said Holmes, "and I should have been more careful not to be seen. We are dealing with a very clever criminal, Watson." "What a pity that we did not get the number of the cab," I said. "My dear Watson, I may have made a mistake, but I was not stupid. The number is 2704. I should have hired another cab and followed this one, instead of trying to see the man." "Would you recognize him if you saw him again?" "I would recognize the beard," I said, "but nothing more." "It was probably false," said Holmes. A few moments later, we walked into an office where the manager greeted Holmes like an old friend, and soon Holmes arranged to have a messenger boy called Cartwright work for him. "There are 23 hotels near Charing Cross," he told the boy. "I want you to go to each one of them and give the porter 1 shilling. Here are 23 shillings. Then you will ask to look at yesterday's waste paper. Tell the porter that you are looking for a lost telegram. But what you are really looking for is a copy of the Times, with the inside page cut up. Here are 10 more shillings in case of emergency." Chapter 5. At the Northumberland Hotel. Sherlock Holmes was a very remarkable man, and one of his most remarkable abilities was to switch his mind away from a problem while he focused on something else. After sending the boy off to the hotels around Charing Cross, Holmes and I went to the art gallery and looked at an exhibition of Belgian masters. He talked of nothing but art. It was as if he were not engaged upon a difficult and mysterious case. However, as 2 o'clock approached, we walked to the Northumberland Hotel to keep our lunch appointment. "Sir Henry Baskerville is waiting for you upstairs," said the clerk when we arrived. "He asked me to show you up at once when you came." "May I have a look at your register?" asked Holmes. "Of course," replied the clerk. The register showed that 2 names had been added after Sir Henry's and Dr. Mortimer's. One of them was Theophilus Johnson of Newcastle, and the other was Mrs. Oldmore from Alton. "I think I know this Mr. Johnson," Holmes told the clerk. He's a lawyer, isn't he, with gray hair, and he limps?" "No, sir. This Mr. Johnson owns a coal mine, and is still quite young. I didn't notice a limp." "Are you sure?" "Certain, sir. He has used this hotel for many years, and is well known to us." "Ah, well, that settles it. But I think I know this Mrs. Oldmore, too. The name seems familiar. It's interesting that when calling on a friend, one often finds another." "She's an invalid lady, whose husband was once the mayor of Gloucester," said the clerk. "She always comes here when she comes to town." "Thank you. I'm afraid I don't know her after all." We stepped away from the desk, and Holmes explained that he had asked those questions to find out whether the people following Sir Henry had come to the hotel to watch him more closely. They had not, and he thought that this was interesting because it meant that although they were eager to see him, they did not want him to see them. We were climbing the stairs, and he was about to say more when, suddenly, Sir Henry himself stood before us. His face was flushed with anger, and he held an old boot in one hand. He was so angry that he could hardly speak, and when he did, it was very difficult to follow what he was saying. "They think I am a fool. They are messing around with the wrong man, let me tell you. If that fellow can't find my boot, there will be trouble. I can take a joke with the best of them, Mr. Holmes, but a joke can go too far, and it has gone too far this time." "Still looking for your boot?" asked Holmes. "Yes, sir, and I mean to find it." "But why are you carrying an old boot? I thought you said it was a new boot that you had never worn." "They took the new boot last night, but now they have taken my old one as well. The only complete pair of boots I have left is the pair I'm wearing." A waiter approached the angry baronet and reported that the hotel had been searched and all the staff questioned, but no sign of the boot had been found. "Either you find that boot, or I will leave the hotel tonight," shouted Sir Henry. "Yes, sir, I am sure that it will be found," said the frightened waiter as he hurried away. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holmes, to make such a fuss over a trivial matter like a lost boot, but it really does annoy me. The hotel should not allow such strange things to happen." "It is not a trivial matter," replied Holmes. "In fact, I find it very interesting." "How can it be interesting? It is just incompetence in the hotel. The case of your uncle's death is a very strange and difficult matter, Sir Henry, and I am not sure that the loss of your boots is unconnected. We have several threads in our hands, and I'm sure that one of them will lead us to the truth. We may waste time following the wrong one, but one of them will be right." We had a pleasant lunch, during which we hardly spoke of the business that had brought us together. It was not until after lunch, when we sat in the private sitting room, that Holmes asked Baskerville what his intentions were. "To go to Baskerville Hall," he replied. "And when?" "At the end of the week." "I think your decision is a wise one," said Holmes. "I have evidence that you are being followed and watched in London, and I think that you are probably in greater danger in the crowds of the big city than you would be in Dartmoor. Did you know that you were followed from my house this morning, Dr. Mortimer?" Dr. Mortimer was surprised. "Followed? By whom?" "Unfortunately, I cannot tell you." "Do any of your friends or acquaintances in Dartmoor have a black beard?" "Yes, Barrymore, Sir Charles's butler, has a big black beard." "Where is he?" "He should be at the hall." "We'd better check to see if he is really there, or whether he might somehow be in London." "How can we do that?" "We'll send him a telegram asking if everything is ready for Sir Henry's arrival. That will go through the post office at Grimpen. Then we'll send another telegram to the postmaster asking him to make sure that the first telegram is delivered to Barrymore personally, and that if it can't be delivered that way, to return the telegram to you here at the Northumberland Hotel. That should tell us by this evening whether or not Barrymore is at the Hall." "By the way, Dr. Mortimer, who is this Barrymore?" asked Sir Henry. "He is the son of the old caretaker, who died a few years ago. The family has looked after the Hall for 4 generations now, and as far as I can tell, Mr. and Mrs. Barrymore are a very respectable couple." "Yes, but while the family is not using the house, they have a mighty fine house and nothing to do," said Sir Henry. "That's true. Did Barrymore profit from Sir Charles's will?" asked Holmes. He and his wife had £500 each, replied Dr. Mortimer. Did they know that they would receive this money? Yes. Sir Charles made no secret of it. That's very interesting, said Holmes. I hope that you do not suspect everybody who received money from Sir Charles, said Dr. Mortimer, because he gave me £1,000 and gave money to others as well. How much was left for Sir Henry after all these generous gifts? Asked Holmes. £740,000. That's a very large amount. I didn't know so much money was involved, said Holmes. We didn't know either, said Dr. Mortimer, until after he had died, and we examined his accounts. With such a large amount of money at stake, I really have to ask the next question, said Holmes. Forgive me, Sir Henry, but if anything happened to you, who would then inherit the estate? Since Sir Charles's youngest brother, Roger, died unmarried, the estate would go to the Desmonds, who are distant cousins. James Desmond is an elderly clergyman in Westmoreland. Have you met him? Asked Holmes. Yes, he once came to visit Sir Charles, and though he is not wealthy, he refused to accept the money that Sir Charles offered him. Thank you, said Holmes. I think you should go down to Dartmoor without delay, Sir Henry, but I must insist that you do not go alone. Dr. Mortimer is coming with me, but Dr. Mortimer will be busy with his work and may be unable to help you. You need somebody who can be by your side at all times. Could you come yourself, Mr. Holmes? I have a case that I must deal with here in London and cannot leave, but I think that my friend Dr. Watson would be an excellent choice if he was willing to go. Chapter 6. Dead Ends. Holmes's suggestion that I should accompany Sir Henry Baskerville down to Dartmoor and Baskerville Hall took me completely by surprise. Before I had time to think about it, Baskerville took me by the hand and shook it energetically. That is real kind of you, he said loudly. You know just as much about this whole business as I do. If you'll come down to Baskerville Hall and see me through, I'll never forget it. I must admit that I was attracted by the promise of adventure. I also felt honored that Holmes trusted me sufficiently to give me this important task. I will come with pleasure, I said. I do not know how I could better spend my time. You will report very carefully to me, said Holmes. When a crisis comes, as it will, I will tell you what to do. I suppose everything will be ready by Saturday. Would that suit Dr. Watson? Asked Baskerville. Perfectly, I replied. Then, unless you hear otherwise, we shall meet at Paddington Station in time for the 10:30 train. We stood up to leave, when suddenly Baskerville gave a cry of triumph and dived into one of the corners of the room. He knelt down and pulled a shiny new boot from under a cupboard, crying, "My missing boot." "May all our problems be solved as easily," said Holmes. "But this is very strange," said Dr. Mortimer. "I searched this room very carefully just before lunch." "And so did I," added Baskerville. "We searched every inch of it. Then the waiter must have put it there while we were at lunch." Sir Henry called for the waiter and asked him about it, but he denied all knowledge of it and could give no explanation for the boot being under the cupboard. It remained a mystery, and Holmes thought about it on the way back to his house in Baker Street. Apart from the story of Sir Charles's death, we had the strange letter that was sent to Sir Henry, the black-bearded man in the cab, and the business of the boots, the disappearance of the new boot, the loss of the old boot, and the reappearance of the new boot. No doubt he was thinking, as I was, about how these strange events might be made into one reasonable story connected to Sir Charles's strange death. He sat in his room all afternoon, smoking and thinking. Just before dinner, we received 2 telegrams. The first said, "Have just heard that Barrymore is at the Hall, Baskerville." The second said, "Visited 23 hotels, as directed, but could not find page of Times with cut sheet. Cartwright." That's 2 dead ends, Watson. There is nothing more interesting than a case where everything goes against you. We will have to look around for another way to go forward. We still have the cab driver who drove the man in the black beard. Exactly. I have sent a telegram to find out his name and address. There was a ring at the door, which Holmes hoped was an answer to his telegram. But it was even better. It was the driver himself. He was a very rough-looking man. "I got a message at the office that a gentleman at this address was asking for 2704, he said. "I have been driving my cab for 7 years and never had a word of complaint. I came here straight away to ask you to your face what you had against me." "I have nothing in the world against you," said Holmes. "On the contrary, I have 10 shillings for you, if you can answer some questions for me." "Well, I've had a good day, that's for sure," smiled the cab driver. "What did you want to ask?" "First of all, your name and address, in case I want you again." "John Clayton, 3 Turpey Street." Holmes wrote it down. "Now, Clayton, tell me about the fare who came and watched this house at 10 o'clock this morning, and afterwards followed 2 gentlemen down Regent Street." The man looked surprised and a little embarrassed. "You seem to know about as much about it as I do," he said. "So there is no point in me telling you anything." The man said he was a detective and that I shouldn't tell anyone about him. "This is a very serious business, my friend, and you may find yourself in a difficult position if you refuse to cooperate with me." "When did he tell you that he was a detective?" "When he left me." "Did he say anything else?" "He told me his name." Holmes smiled. "He mentioned his name, did he?" "That was careless of him." "What was it?" "His name," said the cab driver, "was Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Never have I seen my friend more completely surprised. He sat in silence for a moment, and then began to laugh loudly. "He scored against me that time, Watson." He turned to the cab driver. "Tell me where you picked him up and everything that happened." "I picked him up at 9:30 in Trafalgar Square. He offered me £2 if I did everything he wanted for the day without asking questions. I was glad to agree. We drove to the Northumberland Hotel and waited there until 2 gentlemen came out of the hotel and took a cab. We followed the cab to somewhere near here, and we waited until they came out of the house. The 2 gentlemen passed us walking, and we followed them along Baker Street and into Regent Street. Then my fare suddenly said that I was to drive to Waterloo Station as quickly as I could. We were there in less than 10 minutes, and as he gave me the £2, he said, "It may interest you to know that you have been driving Mr. Sherlock Holmes. That's how I know the name." "Did you see any more of him?" "No, sir, not after he went into the station." "How would you describe this Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" The driver scratched his head. "He's not easy to describe. I'd say he was about 40 years of age, and he was of a middle height, 2 or 3 inches shorter than you, sir. He was dressed like he was upper class, and he had a black beard, cut square at the end, and a pale face. I don't know if I can say more about him." Holmes gave him the 10 shillings, promising him another 10 if he could remember anything else later, and the man left, chuckling quietly. "This is a dangerous enemy, Watson. He knew our street number, and that Sir Henry had been to see me. He knew that I would get the number of the cab, so he gave him this cheeky message. I'm a bit sorry to send you to Dartmoor without me, but it can't be helped." Chapter 7. Baskerville Hall. On Saturday, Holmes drove with me to the station. "I have made some enquiries about Mr. James Desmond," he told me, "and he is as old and kind as Mortimer told us. We can leave him out of our calculations, which leaves only the people who live around Sir Henry on the moor. I want you to write to me and tell me anything that you think is important, but just tell me facts. I will make the theories." "Should we get rid of the Barrymore couple first?" I asked. "No. If they are innocent, it would not be fair, and if they are guilty, we will never find out by dismissing them. There is a groom at the Hall, I think, and 2 farmers nearby. Then there is our friend Dr. Mortimer, who I think is honest, and his wife. There is the naturalist Stapleton, and his sister and Mr. Frankland of Laughter Hall, who is also unknown to us. These are the people that you must study." Our friends were already at the station, and had no news. They had not seen anybody following them, and had spent almost all their time together. Holmes warned them not to go anywhere alone, and especially not to venture onto the moor when it was dark. Something terrible will happen if you do. Did you find your other boot? No, it is gone forever. As the train pulled away from the platform, I looked back to see the tall figure of Holmes standing in the morning mist, watching the train depart. The journey was swift and pleasant. Sir Henry, who had not been to the moor since he was a child, was delighted to see the fields of Devon again. In the distance, we saw a sad, grey hill with a jagged peak, which was the beginning of the moor. We eventually arrived at a small wayside station, where we got off. The station master and several porters took our luggage to a waiting carriage. I was surprised to see 2 soldiers with guns at the station, who looked very carefully at us as we passed. Soon, we were in a carriage and speeding along the road. Green fields lay in the foreground, but the moor filled the background with its gloomy bare hills and rocks. The carriage drove up a hill, then beside a stream, through a forest, and into a valley. We rounded a bend, and then saw, on a peak of the moor, a soldier on a horse, holding a gun and watching the road. "What's this?" asked Baskerville. The driver told us that a prisoner had escaped from the jail 3 days ago, and had not been found yet. The prisoner's name was Selden, and he was a murderer. The farmers were worried about it, and the soldiers were doing their best to recapture him. A little further along the road, we stopped at the top of a rise. Before us lay the vast barren moor. A cold wind came from it, and we remembered that an escaped prisoner was hiding out there somewhere. The road climbed up onto the moor, and around the rocks and bogs until we came to a small valley, in which lay Baskerville Hall. A few minutes later, we were at the lodge gates, with its stone pillars and iron bars. The lodge itself was a ruin of black granite, but a new lodge was already half built. We drove up the long, dark drive. The young heir looked around him. "It's no wonder my uncle felt frightened here," he said. "I'll put electric lights along this drive." There was a large lawn at the front of the hall. The hall itself seemed covered in ivy, with holes cut for the doors and windows. 2 ancient towers rose from the center of the building, and black granite turrets were on its right and left. Thin black smoke rose from one of the chimneys on the steep roof. The hall did not look warm or welcoming. "Welcome, Sir Henry. Welcome to Baskerville Hall." A tall man stepped out of the shadows of the house to open the door of the carriage. A woman came behind him, and the pair helped to get the luggage down. Sir Henry and I climbed down, and the carriage drove on to take Dr. Mortimer home. We entered the hall, and the heavy doors closed noisily behind us. We entered a large room with heavy oak rafters and a huge stone fireplace, where a fire burned cheerfully. We stood near it because the journey from the station had been cold and tiring. We looked around at the high, thin windows of stained glass and the stags' heads on the walls. "It's just as I imagined it," said Sir Henry. "It's amazing to think that my family has lived in this place for 500 years. Barrymore came into the room and asked if Sir Henry would like dinner served immediately. He told us that there was hot water in the rooms and promised that his wife and he would look after the hall until Sir Henry had made new arrangements." "What new arrangements?" asked Sir Henry. The Barrymores thought that the new owner of the hall, being younger than Sir Charles had been, would require more staff for his busier life. They did not really wish to leave Baskerville Hall because of the family connection that had lasted so long, but they felt unhappy there after the death of Sir Charles and would leave when it was convenient for Sir Henry. "But what will you do?" asked Sir Henry. "Sir Charles's generosity means that we can establish a business of some sort," replied Barrymore. "But perhaps I had better show you your rooms now." He led us up the stairs to a kind of internal balcony that ran all the way around the large entrance hall. From here, 2 long corridors ran the whole length of the building and led to the bedrooms. My room was in the same wing as Baskerville's and almost next to it. The dining room opened off the hall and was a long, shadowy room with portraits of old Baskervilles on the walls. Dinner was very quiet, and we were happy to retire into the more modern billiards room afterwards. "It's not a cheerful house," remarked Sir Henry. "I'm not surprised my uncle was nervous living in it alone." We went to bed early. I opened the curtains in my room. I could see the moonlight on the lawn in front of the hall, and beyond it, the long, low curve of the moor. I closed the curtains and crept into my bed. I was tired but could not sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, I heard a woman sobbing. It did not last long, and I did not hear it again that night. Chapter 8. The Stapletons of Merripit House. The morning was sunny, and the dining room was more cheerful when I mentioned the sobbing noise to Sir Henry at breakfast. He had heard it too, and immediately asked Barrymore about it. There are only 2 women in the house, he told us. One of them is the kitchen maid, who sleeps in the other wing, and the other is my wife. And I can tell you that the sound did not come from her. This was a lie, because shortly after breakfast I met Mrs. Barrymore in the corridor. She was a large woman with a serious expression on her face, but her red eyes showed that she had been crying. Her husband must have known it. Why had he lied about it? Why had she cried? I was already beginning to feel uncomfortable about this tall butler with the black beard. It was he who had discovered the body of Sir Charles. Could we be sure that his story was true? Was he the black-bearded man we had seen in the cab in Regent Street? The cab driver said he was a short man, but he might have been wrong. I walked 4 miles along the edge of the moor to Gripen to visit the postmaster there. He told me that his son had delivered the telegram to Barrymore personally, but when I asked the boy about it, he told me that Mr. Barrymore was in the loft at the time, so he gave it to his wife. He had not seen Mr. Barrymore. We could not be sure that he was not in London despite the telegram. But why would he make trouble for the Baskerville family? Perhaps Sir Henry had been correct when he pointed out that they lived in a fine house and had nothing to do when the owners were away. Had Barrymore sent that odd letter with the words cut from the Times? I wished that Holmes would soon be able to come to Dartmoor and answer these questions. As I strolled back toward Baskerville Hall, I heard somebody running behind me and calling me by name. I turned, expecting to see Dr. Mortimer, but it was a stranger. He was a short, slim man in his 30s, wearing a gray suit and carrying a butterfly net and a box. He introduced himself as Stapleton of Merripit House. He had been visiting Dr. Mortimer and saw me walk past the house. The doctor had told him who I was, and he had decided to walk with me. He asked if Sir Henry was well after his journey and said he was glad that he had come to live at the Hall. I hope he is not afraid of that legend about the Hound, he added. Unfortunately, Sir Charles became so nervous about it that you could say that it killed him. How? I think that some dog chased him, and he thought it was the Hound. His heart was too weak for such a shock. Have you or Sherlock Holmes come to any other conclusion? How did he know about Sherlock Holmes? I stared at him in amazement. He noticed my surprise. When Mortimer told me your name, I knew who you were, he explained. Your name and its connection with Sherlock Holmes are famous, even here on the moor. It would be interesting to know what such a great detective thought about it. I'm sorry that I can't satisfy your curiosity. Is he coming here himself? He is too busy with another case at present. What a pity. If I can help you with anything, please let me know. I thanked him, but said I needed no help, and he invited me to come and meet his sister. Merripit House is just a short walk along this path, and she would be delighted to meet you. I knew that Sir Henry would be busy with his papers that morning, so I accepted the invitation, and we walked down the path together. The moor is a wonderful place, he said. It contains so many wonderful secrets. I have only been here 2 years, but I have explored it and know it as well as anybody can. He pointed out a grassy plain. That's the great Grimpen Mire, which is full of bog holes. If you step into one, you will sink to your death. Just yesterday, I saw a moor pony go down, but I know how to cross it and return alive. Look, there's another pony now. I looked where he was pointing and saw the pony struggling in the mire. It will never get out, said Stapleton. That's 2 in 2 days. It's a very bad place, the Grimpen Mire. But you can get across, I said. Yes, I have found 1 or 2 paths that an active man can use. But why would you want to go there? The hills that you can see on the other side are really islands in the mire, and that is where rare and unusual butterflies and plants live. I will try it one day, I said, but he warned me not to do it. You'll never come back alive. At that moment, I heard a long, low moan coming across the moor. "What is it?" I asked. "Some people say it is the hound of the Baskervilles calling its prey. I've heard it before, but never this loud. It's probably the mud settling, or a strange bird." He pointed out some stone rings on a hillside and explained that they were the remains of the homes of prehistoric people. Suddenly, he excused himself and ran off, chasing a butterfly. I watched him run into the grimpen mire, leaping from one safe place to another. Then, I heard footsteps and saw a woman come along the path toward me. I guessed that it was Stapleton's sister, although she did not look like him at all. She was tall and dark and very beautiful. Before I could say anything to her, she said, "Go back. Go straight back to London immediately." I stared at her in surprise. "Why should I go back?" "I cannot explain, but please go back and never set foot upon the moor again." "But I have only just come." "This warning is for your own good. Go back to London, I tell you tonight." "Quiet. My brother is coming. Don't tell him what I said." Stapleton had lost his butterfly and came back to us. "Hello, Beryl," he said, in what I thought an unfriendly tone. "Hello, Jack. You're hot," she replied. "Chasing a butterfly," he explained. "Missed him." "I was just talking to Sir Henry about the beauties of the moor," she said. No, I said. "I am not Sir Henry. My name is Dr. Watson." She looked annoyed for a moment and explained that she had made a mistake. We walked on to Merrypit House, where we were met by a very old servant. It was a desolate, lonely place. Stapleton told me that he once had a school, but illness killed 3 of the boys, and the school was closed. He had found this house, which enabled him to study butterflies and insects not found in other parts of England, and he was quite happy to live there with his sister. They invited me to stay for lunch, but I declined and set out for Baskerville Hall along the path. However, there must have been a shortcut, because I found Miss Stapleton on the road ahead of me, flushed with running. "I'm sorry I thought you were Sir Henry," she said. "Please forget what I said." "I cannot forget it, because I am Sir Henry's friend, and I'm worried about him." "Why did you want him to go back to London? Tell me what you meant, and I will pass on your warning to Sir Henry." "Do you know the story of the Hound?" she asked. "Yes, but I do not believe such nonsense." "But I do, and I was afraid for Sir Henry." "Then why did you say I should not tell your brother what you said?" "He is very keen that Baskerville Hall should be occupied for the good of the people of the moor. He would be angry with me if he knew that I wanted Sir Henry to leave." With that, she said goodbye and began to run back to Merrypit House. Chapter 9. First Report of Dr. Watson. Baskerville Hall, October 13th. My dear Holmes, my previous letters and telegrams have kept you up to date with what has happened so far in this miserable part of the world. I haven't written for a few days because nothing important happened. However, now something surprising has happened, which I will write about in a moment. First, let me keep you up to date about some other factors in the situation. I have not said much about the escaped murderer. It is now 2 weeks since he escaped, and it is believed that he has left the moor, which makes all the farmers feel safer. He could still be hiding in one of the prehistoric stone huts, it's true, but there is nothing for him to eat, and the most likely result is that he has gone away. I am relieved for the Stapletons, because they have almost no protection against the prisoner if he tries to attack them, and live miles from any help. I offered to send our groom, Perkins, to sleep there, but Stapleton would not accept it. Sir Henry is showing a lot of interest in Miss Stapleton, which is not surprising, considering that she is a beautiful and interesting woman. She is very different from her rather plain and boring brother. However, he must have some passions because there are times when she seems a little afraid of him. I hope he does not mistreat her. He visited us at Baskerville Hall on that first day, and the next morning took us to see the place where the Baskerville Hound is supposed to have killed the evil Hugo. It is in a small valley that contains 2 large stones shaped like the teeth of a hound. Sir Henry was very interested, and it seemed to me that Stapleton half believed the story himself. He told us about several families where similar curses had resulted in untimely deaths. On the way back, we stopped at Merrypit House for lunch, and that is when Baskerville met Miss Stapleton. They seemed attracted to each other from the very first moment. He spoke about her constantly on the way home, and we have seen them almost every day since then. They are dining here tonight, and we are dining there next week. You would think that Stapleton would be very pleased at this development, but I have seen him look at her with disapproval when Sir Henry has been talking to her. I think it would be very selfish of him to stand in the way of their relationship. It is going to be very difficult to prevent Sir Henry from going out alone if this goes any further. I am sure that I would not be popular if I accompanied him at all times. On Thursday, Dr. Mortimer lunched with us and showed us and the Stapletons where Sir Charles died. It is a long path, down which he ran, with a row of tall trees on each side. We saw the gate at which the poor man had smoked his cigar. It is a white wooden gate, and beyond it lies the moor. I tried to imagine what fear had made Sir Charles run to his death on that dark night. What was he trying to run away from? Was it his imagination? Was it real? And if so, did any human have anything to do with it? Did Barrymore know more than he had told us? I have also met Mr. Frankland of Laughter Hall, which is about 4 miles south of Baskerville Hall. He is an old man with a red face and white hair who spends all his money on fighting people in court, especially about rights of way. He doesn't seem to care which side he is on. It is just an amusing hobby for him. I was told that he has 7 cases running at the moment. It must be costing him a fortune. Apart from that, he seems a kindly, good-natured person. He is also interested in astronomy and has a good telescope, which he is using to search for the escaped prisoner. Now I come to the surprising events of last night. When I told Sir Henry what I had learned from the postmaster's boy, he immediately asked Barrymore about it. Barrymore's story matched that of the postmaster's boy exactly, but he was upset because he felt that Sir Henry had not trusted him. However, he was very grateful when Sir Henry gave him some of his old clothes, which had just arrived from London and for which he had no further use. Mrs. Barrymore interests me. She is a large woman and very respectable, but I have seen her with tears in her eyes more than once, and I am sure that she is carrying some secret sorrow. Perhaps it is a guilty sorrow, or perhaps Barrymore treats her unkindly. I have always thought that there was something strange about him, but last night brought it all to a head. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I heard footsteps going quietly past my bedroom door. I opened the door and looked out to see a long, black shadow going down the corridor. The shadow was made by a man carrying a candle, and his height told me it was Barrymore. He walked very slowly and carefully, so I followed him equally slowly and carefully. I saw him enter a room which I knew to be unfurnished. I crept up to the door and looked in. Barrymore was kneeling at the window, staring across the moor and holding the candle to the glass. He stayed like this for several minutes without moving. Then he groaned and put out the candle. I went as quickly as I could back to my room, and not long afterwards, I heard his footsteps pass by my door again. Much later, when I was almost asleep, I heard a key turn in a lock somewhere. I do not know what it means, but I do know that there is some secret business going on in this house of gloom. I spoke about it to Sir Henry this morning, and we have made a plan. It should make my next report interesting reading. Chapter 10. Second Report of Dr. Watson. Baskerville Hall, October 15th. My dear Holmes, here is my second report. Many things have happened in the last 2 days, and I am sure that some of them will surprise you. Some things have become clearer, while other things have become more complicated. I will tell you everything, and you can judge for yourself. Before breakfast on the night after I had seen Barrymore at the window, I went to the room he had used and noted that the window of that room had a better view of the moor than any other window in the house. He was looking for something on the moor, and I thought that perhaps he was involved in a love affair, which might explain his wife's unhappiness. When I told Sir Henry about my adventure, he was not surprised, because he had heard Barrymore walking about in the house at night on previous occasions. We decided that we would wait up and try to follow him that night, if he did it again. In the meantime, I should tell you that Sir Henry is working hard at making plans to improve the hall, and I suppose that he will want to marry soon. Nor will this take long, if the lady is willing, for he seems to be quite taken with the beautiful Miss Stapleton. However, the course of love does not run smoothly, That morning, he wished to go out, and, as I was about to follow him, he indicated that my presence would hinder his purpose with the lady. I let him go, but was sorry afterwards and rushed out after him. Perhaps I could still overtake him. I hurried along the path to Merripit House, and from the top of a rise, I saw him walking with a lady, who could only be Miss Stapleton. They were walking slowly, and I could see that she was speaking, while he listened carefully and sometimes shook his head. What should I do? I felt that it would be an outrage to break in on their private conversation, but I also felt that I was spying on a friend if I simply continued to watch. The only solution I could think of was to continue my watch and to tell him later that I had done so. Then I saw Stapleton with his butterfly net. He was closer to them than I was, but had not yet seen them. At that moment, Sir Henry put his arm around Miss Stapleton, but she seemed to pull away from him. Suddenly, they jumped away from each other and turned around. Stapleton was running toward them on the path, and he was clearly very angry. Of course, I could not hear what was being said, but it seemed that Sir Henry was trying to explain something to Stapleton, while Miss Stapleton stood silently beside her brother. Finally, Stapleton turned and walked toward Merripit House, making his sister follow him. And Sir Henry walked slowly back toward Baskerville Hall, with his head down. I felt ashamed for having watched this event, and when he saw me, I immediately apologized. At first he looked angrily at me, but then he laughed. I thought I was in a private place, but it seems the whole county was watching me. Did you see the brother? Yes, I did. Have you ever thought that he might be crazy? I can't say that I ever did. I hadn't either, until today. I don't understand what objection he has to me becoming his brother-in-law. I'm healthy, I'm rich, and I love his sister. Yet, he wouldn't let me so much as touch the tips of her fingers. Is that what he said? That and a whole lot more. Listen, Watson, I've only known her for a few weeks, but I feel that we were made for each other. I'm sure that she feels about me the way I feel about her, and she was glad enough to meet me, although she would not let me talk about love. She kept telling me that this was a dangerous place and that I should leave it, but I told her that since I had met her, I was in no hurry to go anywhere else. If she really wanted me to go away, I told her, all she had to do was agree to go with me. I was asking her in so many words to marry me, but before she could begin to answer me, her brother ran up, waving his butterfly net and shouting at me. His face was white with anger, and his eyes were like fires in his head. What was I doing with the lady? Couldn't I see that she didn't like me? Did I think that just because I was a baronet, I could do whatever I wanted? Had he not been her brother, I would have answered him with my fists. As it was, I explained my feelings for his sister, and told him that I hoped she would become my wife. This didn't help. He wouldn't listen to what I said, so I got angry too, and he walked away, taking her with him. What does it all mean, Watson? I had no idea. It seemed to me that he would be the perfect husband for somebody like Miss Stapleton, and that her brother ought to be very pleased at the prospect. That afternoon, however, Stapleton came to Baskerville Hall and offered Sir Henry an apology. He told Sir Henry, who afterwards told me that he was very fond of his sister and relied on her for companionship in a lonely life. He had not realized what was happening, and was so shocked when he saw it that he could not think clearly. He said that he now realized how selfish his attitude was, and that he would no longer oppose his sister's wishes, but he asked Sir Henry to wait for 3 months so that he, Stapleton, would have time to get used to the idea. Sir Henry agreed to wait. So now, at least, we understand why Stapleton was opposed to Sir Henry seeing his sister, even though he is a most suitable husband for her. I am sure you will be proud of my work, Holmes, especially when I tell you that I have solved not only this mystery, but also the one that concerns Barrymore's candle at the window and Mrs. Barrymore's tears in the night. Chapter 11. Second Report of Dr. Watson, continued. Baskerville Hall. My dear Holmes, you'll remember that Sir Henry and I planned to sit up the night after I'd seen Barrymore at the window with a candle to see if we could catch him and ask him what he was doing. I sat with Sir Henry in his room until almost 3 o'clock in the morning, but Barrymore did not appear, and we fell asleep in our chairs. The next evening, we tried again, The hours went by very slowly, and after 2 o'clock, we heard footsteps go slowly along the corridor. After they passed, we opened the door and looked out. We were just in time to see him going into the same room as before, carrying a candle. We crept quietly to the room and saw him again holding the candle to the window and staring out over the dark moor. He had not heard us coming because, as Sir Henry had told me earlier, he was a little deaf. We stood and watched for a moment, and I wondered what we should do next. Sir Henry simply walked into the room. Barrymore jumped up, angry and frightened, and gazed at Sir Henry and then at me. Sir Henry wasted no time. "What are you doing here, Barrymore?" "Nothing, sir." He was so frightened that he could hardly speak, and he shook so badly that the candle almost went out. "I'm just checking the windows to make sure that they are locked." "Don't talk rubbish, Barrymore. This room is never used, and the windows are always locked. Don't make more trouble for yourself by telling lies. What were you doing at that window?" "I was doing no harm, sir. I was just holding a candle to the window." "Yes, we could see that. Why?" "Don't ask me, Sir Henry. Please don't ask me. It's not my secret, and I cannot tell it. I had an idea. I took the candle from him and went to the window with it. He must have been holding it as a signal," I said. "Let's see if there is any reply." I stared out over the dark moor as Barrymore had done, and at last I saw a small light. "There it is," I cried. I moved the candle across the window, and the other light moved too. "It is definitely a signal," said Sir Henry. "Speak up, Barrymore. Who is out there? And what is going on?" Barrymore looked at Sir Henry and said, "It is my business, not yours, and I will not tell." "Then you will leave my employment at once." "Very well, sir. You should be ashamed of yourself. Your family has lived with mine in this house for over 100 years, and here I find you in a plot against me." It was a woman's voice that answered. "No, sir, not against you." We turned to see Mrs. Barrymore standing in the doorway. "We have to go, Eliza. This is the end. You can pack our things." "Oh, John, have I brought you to this? It is my fault, Sir Henry, since he has done a favor for me. It is my brother who is starving on the moor. We could not let him die, and the light is a signal to tell him that food is ready for him. His light shows us where to bring it. So your brother is the escaped prisoner?" "That's true, Sir Henry," said Barrymore. "I said it was not my secret, and I would not tell it. But now you have heard it, and you can see that it is not a plot against you." "I know that he has done wrong, sir," said Mrs. Barrymore. "But he is still my brother, and I cannot refuse to help him." Sir Henry could not blame Barrymore for supporting his wife, and said that they could remain at the Hall. They went to their room. Sir Henry looked at the light on the moor and said, "Come on, Watson, let's go out and catch him." I had brought a gun with me to Baskerville Hall, and went to my room to get it. We were soon outside, hurrying across the dark moor toward the light. It began to rain, but the light still burned in front of us. We thought it might be about a mile away. Then we heard that same sound that I had heard before when I was at Grimpen Mire with Stapleton. The wind carried the noise through the silence of the night, and it rose from a low moan to a howl. Again and again it came. "What was that, Watson?" said Sir Henry, clutching my sleeve. "I don't know, Sir Henry. It is a sound that the moor makes. I have heard it once before. It was the cry of a hound, Watson." I could hear the fear in his voice. I thought it came from the direction of Grimpen Mire. "Don't you agree that it was the cry of a hound?" "Stapleton was with me when I heard it before, and he thought it might be a strange bird." "No, it was definitely a hound." "Can the story about the hound be true after all? Could I really be in danger from a supernatural force? It's all very well to laugh about it in London, but out here on the moor at night, it is a different matter. Shall we turn back?" "No, I want to catch that prisoner." We continued through the darkness, keeping the light in view. At last we saw it in a crevice, but the prisoner himself was nowhere to be seen. He suddenly appeared, this short, ugly man with evil eyes, threw a rock at us and ran away. We tried to chase him, but he escaped. I could have shot at him with my gun, but I didn't like the idea of shooting at an unarmed man. The distance between us grew greater and greater, and finally we sat down and watched him disappear into the distance. As we stood up to return to the hall, I saw a tall, thin man standing and looking out over the moor. I saw him clearly. I turned to Sir Henry to tell him about the stranger, and when I turned back, he was gone. I wanted to go and search for him, but Sir Henry had had enough adventure for the night. He suggested that the man was a policeman or prison guard looking for the prisoner, and we slowly made our way back to Baskerville Hall. Chapter 12. Dr. Watson's Diary. So far, I have been able to rely on my reports to Sherlock Holmes, but now I must rely on my memory and on the diary I kept at the time. I will begin on the morning after we had failed to catch the escaped prisoner on the moor. October 16th. It's a dull and foggy day with misty rain. The house is covered in clouds, which lift now and again to show the moor. It's just as miserable inside the house as it is outside, because Sir Henry is tired and afraid after the events of last night. I also feel that there is danger in the air, and neither of us knows what to expect. I have good reasons to feel this way. I think about the strange death of Sir Charles, and the continuing stories of a strange beast out on the moor, and the sounds that I myself have heard. The legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles feels very real here. Of course, I don't believe it, even if Stapleton does. I am sure that Holmes would not even listen to such stories of a hellhound with fire in his eyes and mouth. Yet, there must be something out there. I have heard it twice, but cannot say what it is. If it is a large hound, where did it come from? Where does it shelter? And where does it get its food? Why does nobody see it in daylight? There are almost as many unanswerable questions about a real hound as there are about a supernatural one. Then, I think of the man in the cab in Regent Street, and the letter warning Sir Henry away from his home. This was a real letter, but where did it come from? And where is the sender now? Has he stayed in London? Or has he followed us here? Is he the man I saw on the rocky hill last night? That man was too tall for Stapleton, and too thin for Frankland. It could have been Barrymore, except that we had left him at the Hall. It seemed to me that a stranger was still following us and watching us. Who could it be? What did he want? I decided to find out, but I didn't tell Sir Henry of my intentions. He had enough to worry about already. This morning, Barrymore complained to Sir Henry that we had chased his brother-in-law, taking advantage of the secret that he had told us. "The man is a public danger, Barrymore," said Sir Henry. "Nobody is safe until he is locked up again." "He is not dangerous," replied Barrymore. "He is hiding and waiting. In a few days, he will be on a ship to South America. Please don't tell the police that he is still on the moor." "Once he is out of the country," I said, "he will no longer be a problem. Perhaps we should let him go, even if we are breaking the law to protect him." Sir Henry reluctantly agreed, and Barrymore was very grateful. "I would like to tell you something that I know," he said. "I should have said it earlier, but I didn't find out until long after the inquest. Do you know something about how Sir Charles died?" "No, but I know why he was standing at the gate. He was waiting for a woman." "A woman? Who?" "I don't know her name, but I know that her initials were LL. Your uncle had a letter from her in the morning of the day he died. It came from the village of Combe Trace, and was addressed in a woman's hand. I thought no more about this letter, but after the inquest, my wife was cleaning Sir Charles's study and found the ashes of a burned letter in the fireplace. Most of it was gone, but the end of it was still there. It said, 'Please burn this letter and be at the gate by 10 o'clock. And then followed the initials LL. Do you have any idea who this woman might be?" "No, sir. I didn't want to talk about this because I did not want to harm the reputation of your uncle. You cannot be too careful when a lady is involved." I thought the information that Barrymore gave us so important that I immediately went to my room and wrote a report of it to Holmes. I wish he was here. October 17th. It has been raining all day, and I could not help feeling sorry for that prisoner out on the moor, all alone in the cold and wet weather. Whatever he had done, he was surely suffering for it now. Then I thought of the other man, the one I'd seen in the cab, and then again on the hill a night or two ago. Was he also out there on the bleak moor? In the evening, I put on my waterproof coat and boots and took a long walk on the waterlogged moor. The rain beat against my face, and the wind whistled around my ears. I found the hill where I had seen the stranger standing, and looked out across the moor from it. The dark clouds hung low over the rocky land and covered the tops of the higher hills. In the distance, I could see the towers of Baskerville Hall. They were the only signs of human life that I could see, apart from the old stone huts of the prehistoric people, but there was no sign of the lonely man I had seen on this hilltop 2 nights before. As I walked back, I was overtaken by Dr. Mortimer, driving his little carriage along the lonely road from the farm of Foulmire. He insisted that I ride with him, and he told me that he had lost his little dog. I thought of the pony I had seen in Grimpen Mire, and privately did not think he would see his little spaniel again. Mortimer has been very friendly, visiting us at Baskerville Hall almost every day to see how we were getting on. I asked him whether he knew any woman in the area who had the initials LL. At first, he couldn't think of anybody, but then he remembered Laura Lyons, who lived at Combe Trace. She is Franklin's daughter, he added. She married an artist called Lyons, who ended up going away with somebody else. Her father had refused to have him in the house because she had married without consent. When Lyons left her, Stapleton, Sir Charles, and I, as well as some others, gave her some money to set up a typewriting business, and she earns an income that way now. He wanted to know why I was interested in her, but I didn't tell him. Tomorrow, I will go to Combe Trace and see if I can find Mrs. Laura Lyons. I have one other incident to record on this stormy, miserable day. After dinner, I had the opportunity to talk to Barrymore alone and ask him some questions. Has your brother-in-law gone away, or is he still hiding out on the moor? I don't know, sir, but I hope he is gone. I haven't heard from him since I left food for him 3 days ago. Did you see him then? No, but the food was gone next time I went that way. Perhaps the other man took it. I stared at him, holding my coffee cup halfway to my lips. You know there's another man on the moor? Yes, sir. My wife's brother, Selden, told me about him. He is not another prisoner, and I don't like it. Something bad is happening around here. I wish Sir Henry was safely back in London. What are you afraid of? Look at the strange way that Sir Charles died. Then there are the strange noises on the moor at night, and now there is a stranger hiding there, watching and waiting. What is he doing? Did Selden say where he was hiding? In one of the prehistoric stone huts. He has a boy who brings him food, probably from Combe Trace. When Barrymore had gone, I went to the window and stared out at the wild moor. What evil purpose would drive a man to hide out there on a night such as this? Tomorrow, I will find that stone hut and the man who is hiding in it. Chapter 13. Mrs. Laura Lyons. The extract from my diary brings the story to the 18th of October, the day on which events began to move very quickly toward their tragic end. I can remember these events clearly enough without referring to any notes. On the 17th, I had discovered that Laura Lyons of Combe Trace had written to Sir Charles on the day of his death and asked him to wait at the gate at 10 o'clock at night. I had also discovered that the stranger on the moor was hiding in one of the prehistoric stone huts. On the morning of the 18th, therefore, I decided that I must be lacking in intelligence or courage if I could not find some further facts that would bring light to the darkness of our mystery. I didn't need Sherlock Holmes to tell me that these were significant clues and that I should investigate them. At breakfast, I told Sir Henry what I had discovered the previous day and invited him to come to Combe Trace with me. He was eager to accept, but then we both thought that I might get better results from interviewing her alone. I left him at Baskerville Hall and drove to Combe Trace, where I soon found the lady's room. She was working at her typewriter when I entered, and she rose to greet me. My first impression was that she was very beautiful. She had beautiful brown hair and eyes, and a lovely color on her cheeks. She asked me how she could help me. Until then, I had not realized how delicate my mission was. I have the pleasure of knowing your father, I began. It was not a good beginning. I have nothing in common with my father, she replied. I owe him nothing, and his friends are not mine. If it had not been for the late Sir Charles Baskerville and some of his friends, I would have starved to death, for all he cared. It is about Sir Charles that I have come to see you. What can I tell you about him? She asked nervously. Did you know him? I have already told you that I owe a great deal to his kindness. I am able to support myself largely because of the interest he took in my unhappy situation. Did you write to him?" Her eyes flashed angrily. "Why are you asking me these questions?" "I wish to avoid a public scandal," I said. "It is better for you to answer them here privately than that the matter should go to the police." She looked frightened at this and admitted that she had written to him several times to thank him for his generosity. "Do you have dates for those letters?" "No." "Did you ever meet him?" "Yes, but only once or twice. He was a quiet man and preferred to help people quietly." "If you only saw him a few times and only wrote a few times, how did he know that you required assistance?" "Several people knew of my difficulty. One of them was Mr. Stapleton, and he told Sir Charles." "Did you ever write to Sir Charles and ask him to meet you?" Again her eyes flashed with anger. "That is an extraordinary question to ask a lady." "I'm sorry, but I must repeat it. The answer is certainly not." "Not on the day of his death?" Her face turned white, and she tried to say, "No." I saw her form the word but could not hear her say it. "I think you are making a mistake," I said, and quoted the part of the letter that Barrymore had told me about. I thought she was going to faint, but she recovered. "Yes, I did write it," she cried. "Why should I be ashamed of it? I needed help. I thought that if I could see him, he would be sure to help me." "Why did you arrange to meet him at such a late hour?" "Because I had just learned that he was going to London the next day, and the matter was urgent." "Then why meet him outside rather than in the house? Do you really think a woman can go alone to a bachelor's house at that time of the night?" "All right. What happened when you met him?" "I didn't go." "You didn't go?" "Something happened that prevented me from going. I cannot tell you what it is, because it is a private matter. I asked her about it several times, but she would not tell me any more. I warned her that she was putting herself in difficult and dangerous position by withholding the truth, but she remained silent. "It is difficult to believe that you are innocent," I said, "because you first denied having written to him at all. Not only that, but you asked Sir Charles to burn your letter. I think the police will take a very dim view of it." When I mentioned the police, she became afraid and began to talk. I didn't want to mention the letter because I wanted to avoid a scandal, not just for me, but more especially for him. He was a kind friend. However, I will tell you what happened. You probably know that I made an unhappy marriage. I hate my husband, and he makes trouble for me every day. He wants me to go and live with him again, and is using the law to force me. At the time I wrote to Sir Charles, I had heard that I could get a divorce if certain expenses could be met. That is why I needed some help. So why didn't you go to meet him? Because I received help from somebody else in the meantime. Why didn't you write to Sir Charles and tell him? I would have done that, but then I saw his death notice in the newspaper the next morning. She would tell me no more, and I left. It seemed to me that she was telling the truth, and yet I thought that something was being held back. I was not entirely satisfied. Chapter 14. The Man on the Hill. Dissatisfied as I was, I could do no more in Combe Trace, and I decided to follow my other clue. The man I had seen on the hill was hiding in one of the stone huts, and I was determined to find him and find out what he was doing. As I drove back to Baskerville Hall, I realized that there were hundreds of these stone huts, but I had my own experience to guide me. After all, I had seen him on the stony hill, and I thought that the hut he was using must be near that hill. All I had to do was to go there and begin searching. I was sure to find it, and him eventually. If he was in the hut when I found it, I would find out from his own lips, at gunpoint if necessary, why he was following us. If he was not in the hut, I would simply wait inside it until he arrived. I was quite excited about my plan. Holmes had not been able to catch him in London, and it would be an achievement for me to capture him where Holmes had failed. Luck had been against us many times in this inquiry, but this time it came to my aid in the shape of Mr. Frankland, who stood at the gate of his house as I came by. He invited me to come in and celebrate with him because he had won 2 court cases in one day. In one of them, he had established a right-of-way across somebody's land, and in the other, he had closed a wood where the villagers of Fernworthy used to hold picnics. He told me that it had cost him £200, and when I asked him if it had done him any good, he was very happy to reply that it had not. "I do not do it for my own profit," he said. "I do it because it is right. I am sure that the people of Fernworthy will be angry, and I have requested the police to give me protection. But they are useless, and won't help me at all. They'll be sorry." How will the police be sorry? I could tell them what they are dying to know, but I refused to help them. This was beginning to sound interesting, and it wasn't long before he told me his secret. "I could tell them how to capture the escaped prisoner on the moor," he said, "because I have seen the young boy who takes him his food. I see him every day through my telescope on the roof, always at the same time and on the same path. Where is this boy going, if it is not to the prisoner?" This was good luck. Barrymore had said that the stranger on the moor was being fed by a boy. Franklin had found the stranger, not the prisoner. I pretended that I was not interested and suggested that it was a boy taking lunch to a shepherd. This annoyed Franklin, as I had intended. "That's a stupid idea. Do you see that rocky hill? Is that the place where a shepherd would go? Your idea is ridiculous." I confessed that I had been wrong, and he told me that the boy always carried a bundle and came twice a day. Suddenly, he jumped up. "Look, there he is now." I could see a small speck climbing a distant hill. Franklin rushed to the telescope and cried out in satisfaction, "It's him! Come and see for yourself." I did and saw a small boy reach the top of a hill and disappear down the other side. "Anybody could guess what that boy is doing," said Franklin, "but it is my secret, and I want you to keep it secret too, Dr. Watson. The police have treated me unfairly for too long, and I will not help them." I was eager to leave and see where the boy had gone, and had to be very firm in declining Franklin's invitation to stay for a meal, and even firmer in refusing to let him walk with me to Baskerville Hall. At last I was free. I stayed on the road as long as he could see me, but then left it immediately. I was out of sight and headed toward the stony hill, where I had seen the boy through the telescope. The sun was already low in the sky when I reached the top of the stony hill and looked down the other side. I lit a cigarette and looked around. I could see no movement apart from a single lonely gray bird, nor could I hear any sound. The bird and I seemed to be the only living things in the world. Below me, I saw a circle of stone huts, and I noticed that one of them had enough roof left on it to act as a reasonable shelter from the weather. As I came close to it, I saw that it had been used recently. I came to the opening that acted as a doorway. Everything was silent inside. The stranger might be hiding there, or perhaps he was somewhere on the moor. I threw aside my cigarette, put my hand on my gun, and walked in. It was empty. However, it was clear that this was where the man lived. Some blankets rolled in a waterproof coat lay on a rock, and between two other rocks were the ashes of a fire. There were also some cooking tools, empty cans, and a bucket half full of water. On a larger rock that was obviously used as a kind of table, I saw the bundle that the boy had been carrying. It contained some bread and some canned food. There was also a piece of paper, and on it was written, "Dr. Watson has gone to Combe Tracy." Why was the stranger using a boy to spy on me? I searched the hut thoroughly, but could find no further clues. From here, it was possible to see the two towers of Baskerville Hall, as well as the patches on Grimpen Mire. It was a beautiful sunset, but I sat in a dark corner of the hut with my gun in my hand and waited. At last, I heard the sound of his boots on the stones. There was a long pause, which showed that he had stopped. Then the footsteps started again as he approached. A shadow fell across the opening of the hut. "It's a lovely evening, my dear Watson," said a well-known voice. Chapter 15. Death on the Moor. For a moment, I couldn't believe my ears. That voice could only belong to one man in the world. It was the man I least expected, but most wanted to see. "Holmes!" I cried. "Holmes!" "Come out," he said, "but please be careful with that gun." I came out and saw Holmes sitting on a rock, smiling at my astonishment. He was thin and tired, but he looked well. Somehow, he had managed to remain well dressed and clean while living on the moor. I was never happier to see anybody in my life, I said. Nor more surprised, I think. I had to confess that this was true, and he confessed that he was also surprised. I had no idea that you had found my hiding place, still less that you were inside it, until I was just 20 steps away. Then I saw your cigarette on the ground and realized that you would be inside, doubtless with your gun in your hand, waiting for the occupant of the hut to return. You must have thought I was the criminal. I did. And how did you find me? I know I was careless enough once to let the moon come up behind me when I stood on top of a hill. Did you see me then? I did. And then you searched all the huts until you came to this one? No. Your boy was seen. That man with the telescope, I suppose. I saw the sunlight flashing off his glass. Holmes went into the hut and came out with a piece of paper. You've been to Combe Tracy, I see. Did you talk to Laura Lyons? I did. Our researches have been running along the same lines, Watson. I'm very pleased that you are here, Holmes, but how did you get here? And what have you been doing? I thought you were in London working on a case. That's what I wanted you to think. I was annoyed because he had not trusted me enough to tell me what he was doing, and he apologized. He explained that it would have placed me in danger if I had known that he was on the moor and that it had given him the freedom to move about and make his own investigations. You are a very kind man, Watson, and you would have wanted to give me food or clothing if you had known I was hiding on the moor, and that may have led to my discovery. I brought that boy Cartwright with me, and he has brought me everything I needed. Your reports, by the way, have been excellent and very useful. He took them out of his pocket. They took a day longer to get to me than you thought they did, but I have appreciated them very much. Tell me what Laura Lyons told you. I told him in as much detail as I could about my interview with the typist. He was so interested that he made me repeat it. This is most important, he said, because it fills a gap in my knowledge of this case. Do you realize that there is a close friendship between this lady and Stapleton? They meet and write often, and perhaps I can use this to get Stapleton's wife on our side. His wife? Yes, the woman who says she is his sister is actually his wife. Good heavens! How could Stapleton have allowed Sir Henry to fall in love with her? Sir Henry's falling in love with her will harm nobody but Sir Henry. Stapleton thought that his wife would be more useful to him as his sister. I began to understand. Was it Stapleton who followed us in London? Yes. And was it his wife who sent that letter? Yes. Are you sure, Holmes? How do you know that the woman is his wife? When you first met him, he told you he had once had a school. I am sure he was sorry he told you that, but it was too late. It is easy to trace a man who once had a school, and it did not take me long to find out that a school in the north of England closed in the circumstances that he described. The school owner, who had a different name, disappeared with his wife, but his interest in butterflies and insects was well known. It was easy to identify our friend Stapleton. What about Laura Lyons? She thinks that Stapleton is a single man, and he is using her for his own purposes. No doubt she thinks that she will become his wife when she is divorced. I did not know that a divorce was being considered, so that information is very valuable. But what is he after? Murder, Watson, murder. Do not ask me the details. I have him in my net, just as he thinks he has Sir Henry in his net. The only danger is that he might strike before my case against him is complete. We must guard Sir Henry closely until then. At that moment, we heard a loud, terrible scream in the darkness. Holmes jumped to his feet. Together, we stared into the black night, but saw nothing. Another scream, closer this time, burst upon our ears, and then we heard the howling of a hound. We ran toward the sound we had heard, and then we heard it again. But this time it stopped suddenly, and everything was quiet. "We are too late," cried Holmes. "I was a fool to wait." We stumbled onwards until we heard a low moan on our left. There, a ledge of rocks ended in a cliff, and at the bottom of the cliff, we could see the shape of a man lying face down, his head doubled under him at a terrible angle. By the time we reached him, he was dead. Holmes lit a match, and we saw the body of Sir Henry, dressed in the same suit he had worn when we first saw him in Baker Street. Then the match went out. We both groaned. I'll never forgive myself for leaving him on his own, I said. It's more my fault than yours, Watson. In order to complete my case, a client has lost his life. It is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. Why did he come out on the moor at night despite all my warnings? We heard his screams, but could not save him. Where is this Hound, and where is Stapleton? We must make him pay for this. We will make him pay, said Holmes calmly. He has murdered the uncle and the nephew, each of them chased to their death by fear of a supernatural hound. We must prove the connection between Stapleton and the Hound. However, there is nothing that we can do tonight but to take Sir Henry's body back to Baskerville Hall. Holmes began to turn the body over so that we could carry it when, to my astonishment, he suddenly began to laugh. Are you mad? I asked. He has a beard. He has a beard. This is not Sir Henry, but Selden, the prisoner. Chapter 16. A Family Resemblance. There was no doubt about it. The dead man was Selden, the prisoner. It was tragic that the man had died, but at least he had deserved death by the law of the land. Suddenly it was clear to me. Sir Henry had given Barrymore some of his old clothes, and Barrymore had given them to Selden to help him escape. Not only his suit, but his boots, shirt, and cap all belonged to Sir Henry. I told Holmes, who remarked, Then his clothes have been the cause of his death. The Hound has been set upon him using the scent from an article of Sir Henry's clothing. Undoubtedly the boot that was stolen from him in London. By wearing Sir Henry's clothes, Selden has made himself the victim of murder. We'd better put the body in one of the huts. I'm quite sure that we can carry it that far. But wait, here comes Stapleton himself. I can't believe it's him. Don't say a word about our suspicions, Watson. We can't let him know anything, or our plans will fail. I saw the red glow of Stapleton's cigar as he came toward us. He stopped when he saw us. Is that you, Dr. Watson? I didn't expect to see you out on the moor at night. But what's this? Somebody is hurt? It's not our friend Sir Henry, is it? He stepped toward the body, and when he saw that it was not Sir Henry, the cigar dropped from his fingers in surprise. Who is it? He managed to say. It's Selden, the prisoner, I said. He seems to have broken his neck when he fell from the cliff. My friend and I were walking on the moor when we heard him cry out. Stapleton was able to quickly cover his look of shock and disappointment. He said, I heard him too. That's why I came out. I was worried about Sir Henry. I had invited him to come over. But when he did not come, and I heard the cries, I was naturally worried. Did you hear anything else? No, said Holmes. Did you? No. What did you mean then? The poor farmers here often tell stories about a supernatural hound, and I thought that there might have been some sound that explained their beliefs. How do you think he died? I suggested that he had been hiding on the moor for so long that it had driven him mad, so that he went rushing about at night, screaming and shouting, and fell over the cliff. Do you agree with your friend's theory, Mr. Holmes? You are quick to identify me, said Holmes. I have been expecting you ever since Dr. Watson arrived. You were just in time to see a tragedy. Holmes told him that he was returning to London the next morning and expressed disappointment that he had not been able to make much progress on the case. We covered Selden's face with a cloth and went our separate ways. Why don't we arrest him? I asked Holmes as we walked away. We can't, because we don't have enough evidence. You and I know what caused Sir Charles's death, and we also know what Stapleton was trying to do tonight. But we would be laughed out of court if that was our entire case. We have no proof, so we have no case. Perhaps it will change tomorrow. I told Stapleton that we are going to London tomorrow, but we will go to Combe Tracy and talk to Laura Lyons again. And I have my own plan, too. He would tell me no more, but he did ask me not to say anything to Sir Henry about the Hound and its connection with Selden's death. Let Sir Henry believe what Stapleton wants us to believe. Sir Henry was not surprised to see Holmes. I knew you would be here sooner or later, he remarked. He was puzzled, however, that Holmes had no luggage or any explanation for its absence. My first task was to tell Barrymore and his wife about Selden's death. She wept over him. To the world, he was a murderer and escaped prisoner, but to her, he was a wayward but loved brother. Sir Henry told us that Stapleton had invited him to come over that night, but that he had kept his promise and not gone out alone. We told him that Selden had been wearing his clothes, and Holmes pointed out that we had broken the law by helping an escaped prisoner. "What about the case?" asked Sir Henry. "I may be able to tell you more about that soon," replied Holmes. "Watson and I heard the Hound out on the moor one night. If you can catch that one, you're a clever man." "I'll catch him, but I need your help, Sir Henry." "I'll do whatever you ask," he promised. "Excellent, and I will ask you to do it without asking any questions about why you are doing it. Whatever you say." "I'm sure that we will soon." He stopped suddenly and stared into the air above my head. "What is it?" we both cried. "I just saw the family portraits," said Holmes, "and thought what fine portraits they were." "I'm glad you think so," said Sir Henry. "I don't take much notice of them myself, although Barrymore has told me who they all are." "Who is this one here, wearing the black clothes?" "That one is the terrible Hugo, who started the whole business about the Hound." Later that night, when Sir Henry had gone to bed, Holmes brought me back to that portrait and asked me to look at it carefully. I could see nothing remarkable at first, but when Holmes stood on a chair and covered Hugo's hat and hair, I suddenly saw the face of Stapleton staring at me. A good detective, Watson, looks at faces and not the trimmings. Stapleton is a Baskerville, and he wants to be the owner of Baskerville Hall. Chapter 17. Setting a Trap. I was up early the next morning, but Holmes was up earlier, for I saw him coming up the drive as I dressed. "We should have a full day today, Watson," he said, rubbing his hands together as he came in. "The nets are all in place, and we will know by tonight whether or not we have caught our fish." "Have you been out on the moor already?" I asked. "I've been to Grimpen and sent a message to the prison about the death of Selden, and I have also been to see Cartwright, who was waiting faithfully for me at my hut. Now, I need to see Sir Henry. Ah, here he is. Good morning, Holmes," said Sir Henry. "Good morning, Sir Henry. Are you ready to take some orders?" "Indeed I am." Holmes told Sir Henry to visit the Stapletons that evening, and Sir Henry asked that Holmes and I come with him. But Holmes told him that we both had to go back to London because we would be more useful there. Sir Henry was not pleased to hear this news, saying that he did not like to be left on his own in the hall at present, but Holmes reminded him that he was to follow orders without asking questions. "I want you to tell the Stapletons that we have gone to London and expect to be back in Dartmoor in a few days' time. This is very important. We will leave here immediately after breakfast, driving into Combe Tracy, and then taking a train. Watson will leave his things here to show that we are returning soon, and he will send a note to Stapleton saying that he is unable to come." "I think I would like to go to London too," said Sir Henry. "Why should I stay here alone?" "Because it is your duty. You promised that you would do as you were told, and I am telling you to stay." "All right, I will stay. One more thing. I want you to take a horse and carriage to Merrypit House when you go there this evening, but send them back when you arrive. Let Stapleton know that you intend to walk home across the moor." "But that is what you have told me so often not to do. This time you may do it safely, but you must stay on the straight path that leads from Merrypit House to the Grimpen Road. Do not leave this path." I was very surprised by Holmes's orders, but I knew him well enough not to say anything while Sir Henry was there. After breakfast, we were soon on our way to Combe Tracy. A small boy was waiting for us on the platform of the station. It was Cartwright, and Holmes told him to take the train to London and from there send a telegram to Sir Henry Baskerville in Holmes's name. If he finds the pocketbook I dropped, could he send it by registered post to my address in Baker Street? Then he sent the boy to the railway office to see if there was a message for him, and he returned with a telegram which read, "Coming down with warrant, arriving 5:40, Lestrade." Lestrade is a good police officer, Watson. He has already replied to my telegram of this morning, and I am sure he will be useful to us. Now, let's visit Laura Lyons. I was beginning to understand Holmes's plan. He was using Sir Henry to convince Stapleton that he and I had really gone to London, Mrs. Laura Lyons was in her office, and Holmes began his interview of her in a way which surprised her. "I am investigating the death of Sir Charles Baskerville," he said, "and my friend Dr. Watson has told me what you told him and also what you refused to tell him." "What have I refused to tell him?" she replied. "You admitted that you wrote to Sir Charles and asked him to meet you at the gate at the very time when we know Sir Charles died. But you did not explain the connection between those two events." "There is no connection." "I think there is. We regard this as a case of murder, and the evidence implicates your friend Mr. Stapleton, as well as his wife." The lady jumped up from her chair. "His wife?" she cried. "It is no longer a secret that the person who pretends to be his sister is actually his wife." Mrs. Lyons sat down again. "He is not a married man. Can you prove that he is married?" "I have come ready to do so," said Holmes, and pulled some papers out of his pocket. "Here is a photograph of the couple in New York 4 years ago. And here are some descriptions of the couple, called Vanderler, who had a school some years ago." This was enough to convince her. "Mr. Holmes, this man offered to marry me if I could get a divorce from my husband. He has lied to me every single day I have known him. Why should I protect him any longer? Ask what you will, and I will tell you everything. But I want you to understand that when I wrote the letter to Sir Charles, I did not imagine that it would lead to his death. He was one of my dearest friends." "I believe you," said Holmes. "I suppose that sending the letter was suggested by Stapleton. He told me what to write. He said Sir Charles would give me the money I needed for a divorce." "Then he stopped you from keeping your appointment?" "Yes. He said that he would try to find the money himself, because it hurt his pride to have somebody else help me. And then he frightened you into keeping silent about the letter when Sir Charles died?" "It wasn't difficult to do. I did not want a scandal, and I did not want to be associated with the death." Holmes thanked Mrs. Lyons for her honesty, and we went back to the railway station and arrived just in time to meet Lestrade, the police officer from London. Chapter 18. The Hound of the Baskervilles. Sherlock Holmes does not like to tell people about his plans until the moment they are fulfilled. He enjoys being in control of the plan, so that he can dominate and surprise those around him, but he is also reluctant to take chances. The result is that it is sometimes difficult to work with him, and that is what Lestrade and I experienced as we drove through the darkness toward Baskerville Hall that evening. We knew that Holmes was going to do something that was dangerous and exciting, but we did not know what it was. It really was going to be an adventure in the dark. We couldn't say very much because we did not want the driver of the carriage to know what we were doing. We drove past Franklin's house and on to the hall. There we got down from the carriage, which was sent back to Combe Tracy, and we set out for Merripit House on foot. Holmes checked to see that Lestrade and I were armed, and Lestrade began to ask him questions. "It's a waiting game," said Holmes. "It's not a very nice place for waiting," said Lestrade, and he shuddered as he looked out over the Grimpen Mire. "I see the lights of a house ahead of us." "That is Merripit House," said Holmes. "I must ask you to keep very quiet now and not talk above a whisper." When we were about 200 yards from the house, he showed us where to hide behind some rocks. Then he sent me to the house to look through the dining-room window, in which there was a light. There were no curtains in the window, and I could see Stapleton and Sir Henry sitting at a round table, drinking coffee, smoking cigars, and talking. As I watched, Stapleton stood up and left the room. A moment later, I heard a door open, and Stapleton came into the yard. He walked to a shed in the yard and unlocked the door. He was only there for a moment before he locked the door and went back into the house. I went back to Holmes and Lestrade and told them what I had seen. Holmes asked if I had seen the lady, but I hadn't, and he wondered where she could be. The only other light in the house was the kitchen, and she would not be there. As we spoke, we noticed a thick, white fog rolling over Grimpen Mire. It was coming toward us. Holmes looked at it and said, "This is very serious because it could ruin my plan and even cost Sir Henry his life. He must come out before the fog covers the path." It was a clear moonlit night above us, and we could easily see the house, but the rolling, thick, white fog came nearer and nearer. We saw the kitchen light go out, which meant that the servants had left that room. The thick fog began to swallow the trees around the house, and then parts of the house itself were covered. Holmes was impatient. If he doesn't come out soon, the path will be covered. We moved up the path, further away from the house, but Holmes would not allow us to go too far. "We cannot take a chance that he will be overtaken before he reaches us," he said. We could no longer see the house. Holmes put his ear to the ground. "I think I can hear him coming." Soon we could all hear him, his quick steps crunching on the stones of the path. We hid beside the path and saw him emerge from the fog and look around nervously. Then we heard the sound of something else, and it sounded like a dog's feet running. We held our guns at the ready and stared at the dense white fog. Suddenly, a monstrous black hound leapt out of the fog. I saw Holmes's face paralyzed in amazement, and Lestrade throwing himself to the ground with a cry of fear. I jumped up with my gun. It was a hound such as no man had ever seen. It was huge, and fire came from its open mouth, while its eyes glowed like smoldering coals, and its body was outlined in flickering flames. I could never have imagined it. The beast raced along the path, following Sir Henry. He was past us before we had recovered our nerves. Then Holmes and I both fired, and the beast groaned, which showed that at least one of us had hit him, and that he was not supernatural. But he did not stop. We saw Sir Henry further up the path, looking back in terror at the beast that was hunting him down. Holmes sprinted after the hound, and I sprinted after him, with Lestrade following. Sir Henry screamed again and again. The hound leapt onto him, knocked him to the ground, and was going for his throat when Holmes emptied his gun into it. The beast howled in pain and rolled onto its back. I ran up and put my gun against its head, but it was already dead. Sir Henry lay on the ground where he had fallen. We tore away his collar, and were thankful when we saw that there were no bite marks there. We had killed the hound just in time. Sir Henry opened his eyes, and Lestrade put a bottle of brandy to his lips. "What was it?" croaked Sir Henry. "What in the world was it?" "It's dead, whatever it was," said Holmes. The huge beast lay dead in front of us, but its savage appearance was still frightening. It was as large as a small lioness, and its mouth still dripped with a bluish flame, and its small, cruel eyes were ringed with fire. I touched part of its glowing body, and, as I held up my hand, my fingers looked as if they were on fire too. "Phosphorus," I said, "and made in such a way that there is no smell." Holmes was apologizing to Sir Henry for having endangered his life. "I expected a hound, but not a creature like this one." "You saved my life," said Sir Henry. "Give me some more of that brandy, and I will be ready for anything. I think we will leave you here for a moment. If you will wait, one of us will take you back to the hall." We walked along the path toward Merripit House, although Holmes said that he was sure we would not find Stapleton there. He will have gone by now because the shots will have told him that we had discovered his plan. The front door was open, so we entered and hurried from room to room. The only light was in the dining room, but Holmes took it with him up the stairs. We saw no sign of Stapleton anywhere, but we found a bedroom door that was locked. "There's someone in there," cried Lestrade. "I can hear a movement. Open the door." Holmes kicked the door down, and we all rushed in. We expected to see Stapleton, but he was not there. The room had been made into a kind of museum for Stapleton's butterflies and insects, but tied to a post in the center of it was a bundle of blankets, which turned out to be Mrs. Stapleton. A cloth had been tied around her neck and another across her mouth so that she could not speak. We untied her. She was weak and exhausted, but managed to say, "Has he escaped? Is he safe?" "He cannot escape us, madam. I do not mean my husband. Is Sir Henry safe?" We assured her that he was, and told her that the hound was dead. She began to cry. "I have been a fool. I knew that he was trying to kill Sir Henry with the dog, and I should have stopped him, but I couldn't." "Tell us where he is, madam," said Holmes. "There is only one place. It is an old tin mine in the middle of Grimpen Mire, where he kept his hound." Holmes opened the curtain and showed her the fog. "He cannot cross Grimpenmire tonight." She clapped her hands, saying that he might find his way in, but would never find his way out. We left Lestrade to look after the house, while we took Sir Henry back to Baskerville Hall, and called Dr. Mortimer to care for him. It would be many months before he was happy and healthy again. Mrs. Stapleton took us into the Grimpenmire the next day, and we searched for her husband. But it was no use. He had disappeared into one of the bog holes like a pony, and was never seen again. Chapter 19. Looking Back. 6 weeks later, on a cold, foggy night at the end of November, Holmes and I sat by the fire in the sitting room at Baker Street. Since our visit to Dartmoor, Holmes had been busy with 2 cases of great importance. In the first, he had revealed the terrible behavior of Colonel Upwood, who was cheating at cards at his club. In the second, he defended Madame Mountpensioner against a charge of murder. He was later proved correct in this case, when the supposed victim turned up alive and married in New York. I had been waiting for an opportunity to discuss the Baskerville case with him, but had to wait until these other cases were concluded, because he would not allow memories of one case to interfere with a new one. Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer had visited us that afternoon, and Holmes was at last ready to talk about Stapleton and the Baskervilles. From the point of view of the man who called himself Stapleton, the case was simple. However, for us, who did not know his motives and could only learn some of the facts, it all seemed very complex. I've spoken to Mrs. Stapleton twice since then, and I'm confident we have all the facts now. I asked him to outline those facts for me. He told me that he could not be sure of all of the facts exactly, as other cases interfered, though he would try. If I wanted better notes, I should look in his file of cases. However, he told me what he knew. My inquiries show that the portrait at Baskerville Hall did not lie, and that this man was indeed a Baskerville. He was the son of that Roger Baskerville who went to South America, where people thought that he had died unmarried. However, he did marry and have one child, who was also called Roger. The boy grew up and married Beryl Garcia, and, after stealing some money in Costa Rica, fled to England. He changed his name to Vandeleur and set up a school in Yorkshire. But the school was soon in trouble, so he changed his name again, this time to Stapleton, and moved to Dartmoor. He was really quite a good student of butterflies and insects, and the British Museum told me that the name Vandeleur was given to a moth, which he was the first to describe. Roger Baskerville, now known as Stapleton, realized that there were only 2 people between him and the Baskerville fortune. He decided to tell people that his wife was his sister, so that he could use her as a decoy in his plan. With the remains of the money he had stolen in Costa Rica, he bought Merripit House, which he chose because it was so close to Baskerville Hall, and then he established a friendship with Sir Charles. It was Sir Charles who first told him the legend of the Hound. Stapleton knew that Sir Charles had a weak heart, and that a shock would probably kill him. He decided that the legend of the Hound could be used to kill his uncle without anybody being able to blame him or even suspect him of murder. He went to London, where he bought the biggest, strongest, and most savage dog that he could find. He brought it to Merripit House by catching a train to the other side of the moor and then walking across it at night so that nobody would see the Hound. He had explored the moor and already knew where to hide the dog. His plan was to set the Hound onto Sir Charles one night, but Sir Charles was too afraid to come out at night because he believed the legend. Stapleton took his Hound for a walk around Baskerville Hall several times, and some of the villagers saw it and began to talk about the huge Hound on the moors. He wanted his wife to lure Sir Charles out at night, but she refused because she was fond of the old man and did not want to play any part in his death. He threatened her and even hit her, but she would not change her mind. Then he met Laura Lyons, who thought he was unmarried, and convinced her that she should ask Sir Charles for money so that she could obtain a divorce. Then he heard from Dr. Mortimer that Sir Charles was about to leave for London, so he decided to act immediately. He convinced Laura Lyons to write the letter asking for an interview and then prevented her from going. He got the Hound from its hiding place on the moor, put phosphorus paint on its mouth and around its eyes, and at 10 o'clock took it to the gate where Sir Charles was waiting for Mrs. Lyons. Sir Charles, of course, was terrified by the dog and ran screaming down the path until his heart stopped, and he fell down dead. Stapleton took the hound back to its hiding place on the moor, knowing that it would be almost impossible for the police to make a case against him. His wife and Mrs. Lyons both had their suspicions, but he did not need to fear them. After all, he was married to one and had promised to marry the other. Now, all he had to worry about was Sir Henry. At first, he thought he might be able to kill him in London. He did not trust his wife after she had refused to help him lure Sir Charles out of Baskerville Hall, so he took her with him to London. He locked her up in the hotel room while he put on a false beard and followed Sir Henry and Dr. Mortimer. Mrs. Stapleton, however, suspected that he was trying to harm Sir Henry, so she wrote him the letter, cutting the words out of the newspaper so that her husband would not recognize her writing if he saw it. It was Stapleton, of course, who took Sir Henry's boots. He needed them so that he could set the hound onto him later. Unfortunately for him, the first boot he stole was new and would not help, and he had to steal another. This proved to me that we were dealing with a real hound and not a supernatural hound, since a supernatural hound would not need such aids. It also shows that facts, which seem to make a case more complicated, can actually make it a lot clearer if they are understood correctly. When Stapleton saw that Dr. Mortimer and Sir Henry came to visit me, he gave up his idea of trying to murder Sir Henry in London. While Stapleton was in London, an old servant at Merripit House, who has since disappeared, looked after the hound. You might remember that I held the warning letter very close to my eyes when looking for a watermark. What I actually discovered then was perfume. White jessamine, to be exact, and I suspected Mrs. Stapleton immediately. I went to Dartmoor after you so that I could watch Stapleton. I stayed at Combe Tracy most of the time, and Cartwright was a valuable helper when I was out on the moor. Your reports went to London, but then came straight back to me at Combe Tracy, so I knew everything that was happening. By the time you found me on the moor, I already knew Stapleton's plan, but I did not have a case which I could use to prove him a murderer, so I made my little trap to catch him in the act. I am embarrassed to say that it almost failed, and Sir Henry was almost killed. Fortunately, he seems to be making a good recovery. On the night of my trap, Mrs. Stapleton had turned against her husband, and he was forced to tie her up so that she could not warn Sir Henry of the hound, expecting that he would be able to win her over when he inherited the Baskerville fortune. Now, Watson, shall we play some cards? Playlet, News Hour, a radio play. We begin this program with a report on the arrest of Roger Baskerville, better known as Jack Stapleton, the naturalist, or Vandeleur, the teacher. 3 years ago, he was suspected of causing the death of his uncle, Sir Charles Baskerville, and of the attempted murder of his cousin, Sir Henry Baskerville. Wendy Stanton is in Grimpen and has the details.
Thanks, Andrew. The famous detective Sherlock Holmes prevented the murder of Sir Henry, the new heir of Baskerville Hall. At the time, it was thought that Roger Baskerville had died in one of the bog holes of Grimpen Mire. Here are Police Officer Lestrade and the widow of Sir Henry's butler, Mrs. Barrymore.
It was a very foggy night. I can still see the fog rolling in over the moor, and everybody said that no man could find his way across the mire in that fog.
It's a terrible place, that moor. It took my brother 3 years ago, and last year it took my husband. He knew the mire as well as anyone, but one false step and he was gone. I'm sure nobody could have escaped from it on that foggy night when Sherlock Holmes killed the hound.
And yet, Andrew, that seems to be precisely what has happened. Mrs. Stapleton, as she prefers to be known, has lived at Merripit House through the generosity of her husband's cousin, Sir Henry, ever since her husband disappeared. This is what she had to say when I spoke to her today.
I am surprised as anybody to hear this news. I knew that he had a secret trail marked out over the mire, and I was quite sure that he had missed his step and sunk in a bog hole. However, I sometimes wondered whether he had a second trail that he kept secret even from me. His body was never found, so perhaps he did escape somehow. How did they find him?
That is the question on everybody's lips here, Andrew. But I believe you can throw some light on it.
That's right, Wendy, because here in the studio I have with me Dr. Watson, Sherlock Holmes's close friend and working partner. Good evening, Dr. Watson.
Good evening. I don't think that Holmes would appreciate that description of my position, young man. I am honored to be considered a friend. That's true. But I'm sure that he does not believe me to be a working partner. I would prefer to be called an observer and occasional assistant.
Thanks, Dr. Watson. I'll keep that in mind. Now, what can you tell us about the extraordinary developments in this case?
Let me begin by saying that I knew nothing about these developments until last month. I thought the case had ended 3 years ago. However, one morning, Holmes was reading the newspaper when he put it down and said, "Watson, I am going to Peru. Would you like to come with me?" An hour later, we were on a train headed for the docks, and that afternoon, we set sail for South America.
Did he tell you the purpose of the trip?
Well, of course, I asked him, but as usual, he did not say anything until he felt that he was ready, which was not until we had arrived in Peru. This is what happened. We were sitting in the dining room of our hotel.
Watson, you have asked several times about the purpose of our little voyage. I am about to tell you. We have come to Peru to arrest Baskerville.
What has he done? I didn't know that he was in Peru. Why, only a few weeks ago.
No, my dear Watson. You have come to the wrong conclusion. I am not speaking of Sir Henry, but of his evil cousin Roger.
But I thought...
Yes, I know what you thought. You thought he had died in the Grimpen mire. You had better leave the thinking to me, Watson. Do you see that woman there? Is she familiar to you?
Why should a woman in Peru be familiar to me?
Look at her carefully, Watson. Remember not to look at her hair, or her glasses on her clothing. Do you see anybody you know?
Good heavens, Holmes! It's Laura Lyons.
Congratulations, Watson. She calls herself Mrs. Lynette now. But you are quite right. It is Laura Lyons. Perhaps you'll be a detective one day, after all. Let's go and wish the lady a good morning. Good morning, Mrs. Lynette. Do you have time to speak to two old friends?
Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson? What? How?
Never mind what and how, Mrs. Lyons. I presume you are waiting for your husband. Ah, here he is. Good morning, Stapleton. Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson, what? How? I'm afraid the game is up this time, Baskerville. I have in my pocket a warrant for your arrest on suspicion of murder and attempted murder, as well as bigamy and fraud. It must have been a terrible shock to them.
It certainly was. They wanted to know how we had found them, but Holmes refused to tell them. Later, of course, he told me about it.
So, how did he find them?
Sherlock Holmes is a remarkable man, Andrew, and the story is a long one. I can tell you that Holmes reads the passenger lists and has a wonderful eye for detail. He suspected that Stapleton had not died in the mire because he knew it too well. I can also say that the publisher of Naturalist News proved helpful, but if you want to know any more, you'll have to wait until I have written and published my report. I can promise you that it will make interesting reading.